Next up, yep. We have the treasurer's report. Ms. Marshall?
So thank you. I know I'm just adding time to the board meeting, but I think it's really important as we're going around and we're doing presentations about school funding and different things when it comes to this November and the ballot issue. There's just a couple of areas I want to expand on and have that available for anybody that wants to learn about these things. So I'm going to go over property taxes and school funding, state school funding here. So 1997, 2000, 2001, and 2002, the Supreme Court of Ohio ruled the state's funding models unconstitutional. To this day, still hasn't been ruled constitutional. This is a graphic from, I think it was in the Columbus Dispatch back when Governor Kasich was in office, talking about how simple school funding was. That case was known as the Duroff decision, and the reason it was ruled unconstitutional was due to the over-reliance on local property taxes, and also because the state uses residual budgeting, which basically means they set their budgets for things that they need, and then whatever's left over, they sort of put towards the public schools. And so that's those were the reasons that the judges cited for that. Just a little bit of history lesson if you're interested. Back to fiscal year 1990, all the various school funding formulas, when we talk about school districts trying to plan for the future, we are subject to the state's annual biennium budget. And so we're continually trying to follow along with what's happening. This is where we are right now. We're in the Fair School Funding Plan model, still using fiscal year 2022 cost data for that formula. So we're a couple years behind with inflation and all of those things. The Fair School Funding model, and this is just a graph that kind of shows how they come up with the cost, the base cost, and then there's some categorical funding that's added into the base cost for that school funding formula. As I mentioned, our funding formula is subject to the state's biennium budget process. Our current biennium budget, we're in the last fiscal year of that. So House Bill 110 was the start of the Fair School Funding Plan with fiscal years 22 and 23. The state implemented it at 17% and 33% in those fiscal years. Fiscal year 24, last year they implemented half. So, and then fiscal year 25 that we're in now, they implemented 67%. And what that means is that they calculate an amount that they think that our school should receive for its funding, and then whatever that increase is, they're applying that percentage to for our funding. And I have an example of what that looks like here. So this is actually a school payment report. Anybody can go online and see this on the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce's website. But you can see it shows what our calculated funding is here, and then what the state is funding, and then there's that calculation that they do for that percentage, and so that's what that does. In the state of Ohio, school funding, public school funding is a shared responsibility between the state and the local community. The state now calls this the local capacity, which is a measure of each school district's ability to raise revenue locally to determine the state and local share to the cost of education for each student. And it does that by taking both the property wealth and resident income of the district and calculates our unique local capacity and compares it to the rest of the public schools around the state. I've shown this graph a number of times. This is the change in our local share and state shares since fiscal year 2021. You can see that we've decreased by 20% since that time. I do just want to make a note, this came to my attention recently, that our mailer that we sent out to all of the residents, fiscal year 2023, the state share on that mailer was showing 43%. That's not correct, it's 27%. I apologize for that error. My graph was recreated in that mailer and I wasn't aware of it and didn't see that. So, but these are the correct percentages here. This is a slide from a presentation I recently attended that shows the change in the state share percentage from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. You can see those dark orange spots all around there means that local shares decreased by 5%, or the state share decreased by 5% or more. In our case, our decrease was about 7% this year. And then the yellow, you can see, was a decrease of 2.5% to 4.9% in the state share. And then you can see the other colors there. So the green or the white, either static or increases there. So the state's cost to public schools significantly reduced in this fiscal year with the updated values and income. Just a snapshot of, since fiscal year 2019, what our total state funding has been compared to what our calculated funding has been. And then just a nice line graph there that sort of shows that. I want to make sure that it's clear that we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with a school funding formula that the state does not fully fund, and we're also dealing with a funding formula that the state is continuing to decrease its share of what it should be funding. So there's a couple of things there. And just a note up there in the top right corner, in May of 2020, some reductions that we saw during COVID times from the governor's office. So while the state's not funding its public schools fully and continues to reduce its share of the responsibility, it continues to expand dollars going to private schools. This table shows the difference between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24 awards, the change for that and the percentage changes there in the Ed Choice and Ed Choice expansion. And this line graph shows since 2014, the state's total dollars going towards private schools that are not at all subject to the same requirements that public schools are. Last year, the state sent over $600 million to private schools. This year, it's projected, for 24, it was projected to be around $1 billion. They haven't released that total number yet, but it was around $1 billion. And I'd just like to remind everybody what our trend looks like for school funding from the state here. Excuse me. The state funds Westerville schools. If you do the calculation for just all of the students and all of the state funding that we receive through the Fair School Funding Plan, about $2,966 per student. If you're a private school with the Ed Choice with grades K through 8, you get $6,166 per student, and grades 9 through 12 get $8,048 per student. That actually might be a typo. I think that's $8,408. My apologies. There's my bird. This is a document that the Legislative Services Commission put together. It's probably been 2 or 3 years ago now. It's 9 pages of the different educational requirements between traditional public schools, community schools, STEM schools, and non-public schools and homeschooling. This slide here shows the requirements for the local report card that Mr. Reeves just was kind enough to share with us. Private schools are not part of any of that. They don't have a report card, nor do they have state audits, which we enjoy here in Westerville. All right, moving on to property taxes. House Bill 920 was approved by the state legislators back in 1976. Let me start over here. When we talk about millage, we have inside millage set by the state constitution. 3.8 mils is our inside millage. It never changes. All other millage is outside millage. It's voted millage. And House Bill 920, approved by the state legislature back in 1976, was approved to help prevent inflationary increases from as property values grow. And so what it does is as property values increase, the county auditors decrease tax rates so that revenue on existing properties remains generally unchanged. And when I say that, what this means is that if we see new construction, then we likely will see a growth in property taxes as long as it's not under like a tax abatement for economic development or something like that. Sorry, I hit that too many times. So this is from the Columbus Dispatch had this article that showed how much home values increased by school district in Franklin County. And so you can see Westerville there at 38%. And what that means is that if your values increased by greater than 38%, you likely saw an increase in your tax bill. If it increased by 38%, you likely didn't see much of a change in your tax bill. And if your values increased less than 38%, you likely saw a decrease in your tax bill. So 30% of homeowners in Westerville schools in Franklin County saw a decrease in their property tax bill as a part of the reappraisals. And I'm going to go through an example of how that might work. So this is my county of 10 properties, and you can see the various property values there. The current tax rate is 45 mills, and you can see the property taxes due. It's collecting around $62,566 a year. If we come in and we have a reappraisal year, and on average, you can see values are increasing by 21%, but the first two properties increased by 35%. Next two properties increased by 25%. Next properties 10%, 5%, and 30%. But on average, values went up by 21%. So what the county does is they look at what's that total amount. They want to collect that same amount on those carryover properties, and so they adjust that rate. So we're no longer collecting at 45 mills, we're now collecting at 37.25 mills. And so that change in property taxes for the property owners means that some are paying more and some are paying less, but the revenue that the district receives stays about the same. And that's how that calculation works. So if we come into an update year, we have that 37.25 mills that's rolled over. We have another update and say it's 21% on average again, but it shifts around. And they're going to adjust that rate down to that 30.71 because, again, we're trying to collect that same amount. And then you can see it shifts who's paying that bill. And that's how that works. So if that same update year at 37.25 mills, we had 21% average growth. But then we added another property to that. That 30.71 mills is still going to be the rate that's going to be adjusted, but we're going to see growth from that new construction as long as it's not under some sort of tax abatement. And so that's how House Bill 920 works. We are subject as a district to House Bill 920. Not every school district is, because there's something known as a 20 mill floor that won't let that 30.7 mills fall below 20 mills. But we are way above that floor. The state of Ohio, through policy over the last several decades, has continued to shift the cost for public schools to homeowners. This is a table from Dr. Howard Fleeter, who's an economist in the state of Ohio, who's well known, has spent a lot of time in this space. And this was part of a presentation he did. So class 1 is our homeowners, and you can see back in 1975, they paid about 46.1%. This also would include any agricultural property. And this, in 2022, which is when this was done, they were paying about 66.1%. And for businesses, you can see that shift. That's shifting from commercial, industrial to residential and agricultural in there. All right, that was my presentation. What questions can I answer for you?
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you. You know, honestly, this is a lot to digest, and I am thinking about our families at home and students that want to learn how the school funding formula really impacts the levy and what's going on. Mm-hmm. I think something you mentioned right now was that the revenue the district receives remains the same despite all of these other external factors. For families that are maybe tuning in or learn about this a little bit later but have more questions for the district, what are resources that are available so that they can learn more about this?
I'm always happy to meet, present, whatever, with anyone that needs it.
Thank you.
I'm always happy for people to reach out to me. And I do have a lot of people that reach out to me and ask me about things. I've met with several people to go over things like this.
Thank you.
I'm not taking questions from the audience. I'm just speaking to the board. You'll have to wait for public comments. Other questions?
I just, for those that are at home, maybe you could explain inside-outside millage.
Sure. So the inside millage, like I said, is set by the state constitution. So it's 10 mills that was set back in the day to be shared among overlapping municipalities and local governments. So our portion of that 10 mills that's shared, so it's shared with the city of Westerville and other entities around us, is 3.8 mills. And so that never changes. We always have 3.8 mills. We do see growth on the 3.8 mills, and we also see growth from new construction. But other than that, we don't see growth on our property taxes.
There's a lot in here. Just a couple of things I want to make sure that I'm taking away appropriately. The amount of funding that the state of Ohio is putting into public schools has been declining, and the amount going into vouchers, private charters has been increasing
Yes,
rather significantly.
yes.
Okay, so that's one. Another one is that since the 1970s, if we want to call it the property tax responsibility, has shifted significantly onto private, homeowners, agricultural land, away from business properties, right? So
Yes.
that's the second one.
Yes.
Okay. And then, third is that when our properties are reappraised, right? What happens because of the House Bill 920 is that the total amount collected stays really close to the same, within a few dollars,
On our voted levies.
on our voted levies, not on the inside, but on the outside mills, on the voted levies.
Right.
But individual property owners might see an increase or a decrease depending on how their individual property was reappraised.
Right.
But that overall, on the outside voted millage, we're collecting pretty much the same amount.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Those are just three things that I think are,
The other thing I want to point out about House Bill 920 is it works both ways. So if property values decrease, tax rates would increase so that the revenue stays about the same, but it will never increase above the voted millage.
Yep.
So this operating issue is for 4.9 mills. If values increase, it won't collect at 4.9 mills, it'll collect it less. But if values decrease, it will never collect more than 4.9 mills.
right? And what we're voting in, when people vote for levies, is, it's articulated in terms of millage, but they're really voting in a collective dollar amount
Yes,
that gets translated to a millage, and then the millage adjusts, but the dollar amount stays the same on those voted
on
mills.
those properties, yes.
Okay, thanks.
I know that you didn't cover this, but I think it's worth noting too. I think what's really telling, to go back to your point too, is that the pupil amount per pupil in that Westerville schools, even, is getting so much less than private schools in K and private schools through 9 through 12 substantially. Thinking about, I know some of our construction dollars are also going to private schools as well. And so we're not just losing a big chunk of money from the formula, but also now looking at losing money in terms of construction costs and upkeep in our buildings. And so I just want to underscore that. And I know that we didn't cover that tonight, but that is a really important point
Yeah,
too.
we didn't, we are part of the Expedited Local Partnership Program, which is with the state, the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. We've been on a list, there's been a public school list around since the 90s, and we've been waiting our turn for that funding. And so the state decided recently to allocate, because we're waiting for our turn, because there's not enough available funds to fund all the schools that are on the list. But the state recently decided to allocate some funds towards private schools before covering all of the public schools that are on that list.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.